She was a young nurse, a new mum, in the prime of her life.
How could he hurt her so badly when all she wanted to do was to love him?
He was an ambulance technician, but he was living a life of deceit.
He was very much a manipulator of women.
Once you've got their trust, he would become someone quite different.
When he raped JaneClough in front of their baby, she went to the police. He swore revenge.
She was going to go and testify that he had raped her on 9 separate occasions.
As JaneClough walked to work to begin her night shift, JonathanVass stalked her every move, waiting to pounce. When he struck on hospital grounds, it was brutal and vicious.
Massive, massive stab wounds. Levels of brutality I've not seen in a very long time.
JonathanVass stabbed Jane 71 times, then to make sure she was dead, cut her throat.
He is a vile, evil predator.
After he killed Jane, he went after her family.
He'd come to kill the baby and torch the house.
It was a murder that shocked Britain. It was a crime that changed the law.
If somebody else had have done this 5 years ago, Jane might be alive today.
2 parallel lives, destined to tragically collide. This is the story of Jonathan Vass's countdown to murder. In November 2009, ambulance technician Jonathan Vass was arrested and charged with the multiple rapes of his girlfriend JaneClough. Vass was locked up awaiting trial, but in a terrifying twist, his legal team managed to get him released. Just 12 days after his arrest, Vass was let out and Jane's world fell apart.
She was devastated. She felt so unsafe. She just thought he was going to come and get her.
But Jane was determined to testify against the steroid-abusing bodybuilder Jonathan Vass.
He was so egotistical that he didn't believe anybody would give evidence against him, and that Jane would love him so much she would never go through with this.
But when his solicitor told him that Jane wasn't going to back down, he was furious. He wasn't going to stand by and let Jane tell the world he was a rapist.
He suddenly is faced with this fact that it is going to go ahead. He will be in the dock, standing there accused as a rapist.
It was Jonathan Vass's trigger for murder.
He knew that she was not going to drop it, that it was going to happen, and that was the motive for wanting to kill her.
JaneClough was born and grew up in Nelson in Lancashire.
She was our firstborn daughter, beautiful brown eyes, just a beautiful person. She grew up into such a lovely young girl. The kind of child that you're just so proud of as a parent. Wonderful.
Her early life was happy and carefree, and she was popular and bright.
Out of all children, she was the most academic. She was fantastic at school. She knew what she wanted to do. She knew how hard she had to work to get it. She cared about people. She was just such a lovely, loving girl. And, you know, from a dad's point of view, she was the perfect daughter.
Jane had a passion for nursing, and it was a vocation she shared with her mum.
I loved her being a nurse. We talked nursey things together, and again, I think it kind of bonded us closer together.
Jane qualified in 2007 at the age of 22 and started work at the urgent care centre at Blackpool's Victoria Hospital.
She was a wonderful, amazing nurse. You would aspire to be like her. It's a very difficult place. You come into contact with many different sorts of people from many different sorts of life, but she treated everybody the same.
Jane was loved by everyone who knew her.
She was a wonderful friend. We spent a lot of time together. I did a lot of things together.
In May 2007, Jonathan Vass started work as an ambulance technician at the same hospital. Vass was born in Luton, Bedfordshire in April 1980. His family moved to Lancashire when he was just 4 years old. He drifted from job to job. He worked part-time as a nightclub bouncer and had a passion for bodybuilding.
He would care for the patients the same as a paramedic. However, obviously a paramedic can give medications, they can give certain things that obviously the technicians can't.
Away from work, the ambulance technician behaved mysteriously, even pretending he was a paramedic.
I think the insight into Vass of having this kind of Walter Mitty type character tells us quite a lot. He knew how to, manoeuvre and manipulate, and, he was good at deception. That's what he did.
At work, Vass appeared to be more enigmatic.
He was always very friendly, always had a joke, maybe a little bit unprofessional. He would be what I would call an idiot. He was stupid, he would say things inappropriately.
But Jane liked him from the start, which baffled her friends and colleagues.
Everyone was shocked when they realised she was going out with him. Something wasn't right about him. I couldn't tell you what. He seemed shifty, I think's the word for it. I think Jane thought that, he was a joker, he was friendly, he obviously flattered her. She liked him from the off, I think.
The relationship began to flourish and Jane fell in love. She thought Vass was the man of her dreams. But Vass was mysterious about his life for a reason.
They were together for about 4 months before it became public knowledge. He was very secretive. He didn't want anybody to know. He wanted it to be their little secret. And it was only when they were going out together that he informed her that he was married.
Vass had been married for 2 years and had 2 small children, both under 5 years old. Jane was shocked at the news, but Vass told her he was leaving his wife, that she'd been unfaithful, and they were in the process of separating. He was lying.
He portrayed himself as the hurt party. He was a deception right from the start.
The deceit was just the tip of the iceberg.
She showed me bruises behind her ear and down her neck and on her chest.
His violence would have a murderous outcome.
I wanted to tear him apart. I just wanted to get him.
Nurse JaneClough met ambulance technician Jonathan Vass at work in 2007. Jane's parents were suspicious of him from the start.
He told stories that his grandma had owned a house on Baker Street in London and that he had this inheritance, and I had suspicions that really he was a bit of a dreamer, a bit of a liar. I didn't trust him.
Vass was living a double life. He was married and had 2 young children and was conducting affairs with other women.
Jane had told us that he had said he was separating from his wife because she had been adulterous on 2 occasions. That's how he came to be interested in Jane.
He carried on with multiple women. He learned, you charm people, then you disarm them and you compliment people, and then once you've got their trust, he would become someone quite different.
But Jane was under his spell, and despite her parents' misgivings, she fell deeply in love with him. In early 2008, after they'd been together for around 10 months, Vass convinced Jane to let him move into her house in Barrowford, Lancashire. Now he had even more control over her and her life, and he came and went as he pleased. He invented night shifts or family errands to run, when in reality he was going home to see his wife and young children.
In actuality, he was going back to the marriage. There was no divorce pending. It was a relationship that was still active.
But Jane had no idea that Vass was lying to her. She was keen to have a family of her own and saw Vass as the ideal father. She challenged him about divorcing his wife, but Vass refused to discuss it, and they began to argue.
She didn't want to be the person that would break up a marriage, especially a marriage where there's 2 children. However, he assured her it was all over, that he only went to see the children, and so she thought he was doing the right thing.
Jane was blinded by her feelings for Vass and wanted to believe in him.
Jane was in love with him and I wasn't, and I think the picture that I got of him was completely different to the one that he spun to her.
Vass divided his time between working at the hospital, living his fantasy life with Jane, and going back to his wife and children. At other times, he spent as long as he could in the gym, building up his strength and power.
He was obsessed by his own body. He was very much a narcissistic kind of person.
He's very body conscious, so he's building himself out quite a lot. I think he was 17 stone at one point, and he obviously takes care of himself.
Vass would alternate from bullying Jane to charming her, making her believe he loved her. After he'd been seeing Jane for over a year, he started using other methods of control, trying to alienate her from those she was closest to.
He was very critical of her. He would put sly comments in, things that you wouldn't even think about at the time, or you might think, that's a little bit odd. Why did he say that? Why do I need to know that she shouted at him this morning before he came to work?
He used to come up without Jane's knowledge and try and tell us schoolboy type tales on what Jane had done. Do you know Jane did this? Do you know Jane did this? I don't want to know.
He's trying to insert himself, saying derogatory things about Jane and, gently trying to create some distance. You isolate and then you start to maximise your control of that individual.
He was fiercely possessive of Jane, wanting to know her every move and checking up on her whenever they were apart.
He just seemed relentless, and I think he became so controlling to Jane that she'd gone out for lunch with her workmates and he'd followed her to see that she'd actually gone out with her workmates. I found that quite disturbing.
As time went on, Vass's obsessive need to control Jane turned violent. It started with slapping, but soon became punching. She didn't confide in her parents at first, but she did tell her close friend that Vass had started to physically abuse her.
She told me that he was being abusive. She was wearing a scarf. She showed me bruises behind her ear and down her neck and on her chest. Obviously, the scarf was able to cover those. I was very shocked, but at the same time, I wasn't shocked because I had my suspicions that this is what he had been doing.
The once happy and vibrant young nurse started to change.
She became a different person. She was withdrawn. She was sad. She wasn't as happy as she used to be.
He zaps her joie de vivre, her sparkle. He starts to drain that very thing that probably attracted him to her in the first place. And it's all about his possession, his entitlement, his right. And he wants her attention 24/7 when he demands it.
But Jane could not bring herself to end it with Vass. She hoped and believed he might change.
Jane genuinely loved him. She wanted to make the relationship work. He knew that. He knew he could press her buttons and probably still talk his way back into, the relationship again. Someone like Vass would use those things to his advantage all of the time.
And then almost 2 years after they'd met, Jane found out she was pregnant with Vass's child. She'd always wanted a family and hoped a baby would finally make Vass commit to her and stop his abuse. But Jane's parents had very mixed feelings about the pregnancy.
I felt not happy, if I'm truthful. I felt that the relationship wasn't like a relationship should be. But I was supportive of her, you know, if she wanted to be pregnant, that's fine. And as a mum, I would be there for her.
I thought that could have led them to want to get married. And I had always dreamed of being able to give Jane away and give her to the right person. And I knew inwardly that I could not give her away to him.
Jane was blinded by her love for Vass. She wanted a stable family life of her own more than anything else. But when she was 30 weeks pregnant, Vass demanded sex from her. When she refused, he raped her repeatedly over the next 5 weeks.
We know that pregnancy is a time where abuse can escalate. The abuser doesn't get as much attention as they want. And for someone like Vass, it's all about me. She doesn't want to have sex with him as much. You know, so he demands it, and when he still doesn't get it, he just takes it. It's his entitlement as he sees it, it's his right, she's his property.
Her unborn child meant everything, and despite the rapes, Jane desperately hoped she could still salvage the relationship with Vass. Not long after, the couple's daughter was born. But 6 weeks after the birth, Vass raped her again, this time in front of their newborn baby. Finally, Jane decided she had to get away from Vass to protect herself and her daughter. She went to stay with her parents. It was the first time she told them of the abuse, but she was too ashamed to describe the rapes. They were reluctant to get involved.
He'd slap her, he'd grip her, leave finger marks on her. What we had seen was disturbing, but Jane was her own woman. We didn't feel we had the right to interfere and say, look, get rid of him.
Throughout all of this time, Vass was still bodybuilding and seeing his wife and children. But he was frustrated that Jane had gone to stay with her parents and was no longer at his beck and call. He was determined to regain control and get her back.
He has to be in charge all of the time. He won't let others do unto him. He has to take control of that situation.
After just a few days apart from Jane, Vass tried a new line of attack. He sent Jane a threatening text message. She replied. He sent back. Vass swore he would get help if Jane took him back.
He begged her and begged her and begged her to come home, which she said she would do if he got help. And he said, well, I've already got help, I've already been to the doctors. But he hadn't. It was all a lie.
Jane wanted so much for her baby daughter to have a stable family life, like she had, that she gave Vass one last chance. She returned to her own home to reunite with him. But they'd only been back together for a few days when Vass raped Jane for the 9th time. For Jane, it was over. Fearing for her baby's safety as well as her own, Jane left home again and moved back in with her mum and dad.
She always knew if something was going to go wrong, that she had somewhere to come.
And it was time to tell them everything.
It's abhorrent. It makes you feel physically sick. And again, it's that ordeal of what she's gone through. I loved her so much for trying to make things work with him, because I don't think I could have. And I loved her so much for finding the courage to eventually report and take it further what he'd done to her. I think Jane was amazingly brave.
Jane had decided enough was enough.
Jonathan Vass came to our attention initially because of a complaint that Jane made in relation to some domestic violence. As that was investigated, it became clear that it wasn't just physical violence, there was sexual violence that had occurred during the relationship as well.
It's bad enough thinking that your daughter's being hurt without thinking that she might be being raped.
Vass was picked up and questioned. He denied the allegations, accusing Jane of twisting the facts. but the police found Jane to be a credible witness.
She was adamant, she was extremely firm. She was interviewed over a significant period of time, and she came across as extremely cogent and a very, very believable witness.
Vass was charged with rape and assault, and he was remanded in custody awaiting trial.
I was so relieved, and yet I was so hurt that he'd hurt her.
As a dad, I just couldn't believe how anybody could treat Jane like that.
Vass was facing jail for rape, but he'd take matters into his own hands to silence the only witness to his crime.
I knew straight away it was Vass. Nobody else would want to hurt her.
Nurse JaneClough was subjected to a series of rapes and assaults by her boyfriend, ambulance technician JonathanVass. When the steroid-abusing bodybuilder raped her in front of their newborn child, Jane went to the police. Vass was charged with rape and assault and was remanded in custody and suspended from his job. On the 10th of December 2009, Vass was charged with a further 6 rapes, making 9 counts in all. What he'd done to Jane was almost too much for her parents to bear.
He was a 17.5 stone bodybuilder. Jane was a little size 8 frame. Talk about a size difference. You know, how could somebody do something like that to Jane?
As long as Vass was in custody, Jane felt safe. But the next day, Vass's defence team applied for bail.
He'd been denied bail twice, and the police had assured her that he could only apply 3 times and it was a done deal and he wasn't coming out. And then obviously he was granted his bail.
Vass was freed. His bail conditions stipulated that he was not to contact Jane, who was living with her parents. He was fired from the hospital and his wife threw him out. He was forced to move in with his parents, 30 miles from Jane's house. But the Cloughs feared that Vass couldn't be trusted to stick to the conditions of his bail.
We just broke down in tears. We couldn't believe it. It makes you wonder, what on earth does it take to keep a victim safe?
A decision that I will never, ever understand or forgive.
When Jane found out Vass had been released, she was horrified.
Her whole world, imploded. She was devastated. She felt so unsafe. She just thought he was going to come and get her.
Jane's life changed in a heartbeat. She was living a nightmare, expecting Vass to appear at any moment.
This house then became a fortress. Doors locked, double locked on the front, checking who's there, into the car, doors locked. Because you just don't know where he might be. Jane knew he would get her.
While Jane waited for a trial date to be set, she started to keep a diary, writing down her innermost thoughts and fears. On the 15th of January 2010, she wrote,
I don't believe he'll just sit back and let a jury find him guilty. He's not going to let them send him to prison. And I can't help thinking he'll get his revenge on me.
2 weeks later, she added,
When is this hell going to end? I know some people think I'm overreacting, as they keep saying if Johnny was going to break bail, he would have done it already. But I don't believe that. I'm scared.
He could be around the corner. He could be just waiting for her. He could just have appeared from anywhere. And that was the real fear that she had.
Jane was still on maternity leave, and as the days and weeks went by, her fear never left her. On the rare occasions that she went out, she was always accompanied by family or friends.
There was always somebody there to protect her, to be here for her. You could see her fear.
On the 27th of February 2010, she wrote,
What's his plan? What's he going to do? I don't think we'll get to trial without him doing something to hurt me some way. I don't think we've seen the last of him.
Despite the charges against him, Vass's wife allowed him access to their children. He spent the rest of his days in the gym and is said to have been taking more and more steroids. But at least it seemed he was keeping to his bail conditions.
There was no evidence that Jonathan Vass was planning anything or had interfered with Jane or her family or brought any pressure to bear whatsoever. And there was nothing that we knew of that caused any concern.
Perhaps because he never for 1 minute believed that Jane would testify against him. But Jane was determined to give evidence and revealed in her diary her fear of what Vass might do to stop her. On the 8th of March 2010, she wrote,
I've been worrying today about Johnny coming to get me, even killing me. What would stop him?
In April 2010, Vass pleaded not guilty to the rape and assault charges, and the date for his trial was set for October. Jane would have to wait another 6 months to get to court, but she was determined to see things through, and on the 26th of May, gave her witness statement to the police as planned. It summarised all the abuse and the rapes Vass had subjected her to, and was to be the foundation for the trial.
Despite all his intimidation, harassment, abuse, she was going to do this for her daughter. She was going to go and testify that he had raped her on 9 separate occasions and subjected her to a horrific series of sexual offences.
Vass's defence team called him and told him that Jane was going to testify. He'd thought Jane would back down. He'd lost control of Jane. Now he knew he was going to be tried for rape. There was no way he could allow Jane to testify against him. He had to stop her. It was the beginning of Jonathan Vass's countdown to murder.
He was so egotistical that he didn't believe anybody would give evidence against him, and that Jane would love him so much she would never go through with this. However, once he's given advice by his legal team that this is going to go to trial, he suddenly is faced with this fact that it is going to go ahead. He will be in the dock, standing there accused as a rapist.
He knew that she was not going to drop it, that it was going to happen, and that was the motive for wanting to kill her.
For the sake of her new baby, Jane was determined to testify against Vass. She just had to try and get through the next few months. Though nervous and watchful, she was planning to return to work soon, so she organised a confidence-building day out with friends.
She felt more confident to come back into Blackpool. We went to the zoo, we went to the park. You know, we had a really nice time.
In late June, Jane went back to work at the Blackpool Victoria Hospital. Her confidence was growing, but her journey took her close to the town of Fulwood, where Vass was living with his parents. Still working out, still doing steroids, still seething with anger.
And the first few journeys, I think, were very traumatic for her. There was one time where she was driving to Blackpool and she had to pull up on the hard shoulder because she was having an anxiety attack.
Once Jane had overcome the hurdle of driving back to work, she had to take further precautions.
When she was coming back to work, she still felt very unsafe. You know, when she got to work, someone would meet her in the car park and bring her into work because she was so afraid that he was going to be waiting for her.
Jane's instincts were right. Vass was breaking his bail conditions. He spent every waking hour in the gym working out, or in his car looking for Jane.
He had been following Jane via her Facebook profile, monitoring where she was going, when she was working, what she was doing, who she was seeing. He was of that mentality.
Jane had no idea Jonathan Vass stalked her for weeks on her daily commute to the hospital, almost 50 miles away. But no one ever saw him, least of all Jane.
She started to rebuild her life. Things were starting to look good for the first time in a long time.
But Vass's bodybuilding and steroid abuse was now out of control. Unaware of the increasing danger that Vass posed to her, Jane strived to get her life back to normal. On the 23rd of July 2010, she even went for a girls' night out.
It was a first big night out. She was so excited and we had a great time. She felt like, I think, the old Jane before it all happened. The next morning we went for breakfast and I dropped her off at home, and my lasting memory of her is waving goodbye, and she was so happy. And then that was the last time I saw her.
Jonathan Vass was playing a waiting game. His blood was boiling. He'd lost his job, he was facing jail as a rapist, and he believed it was all Jane's fault.
She is the reason why he has lost his job, why he feels he is losing everything. That's how he views it, as opposed to he raped her, he created the situation himself, but yet in his eyes, I am the victim, she has done this to me, she is responsible, not me.
It was only a matter of time before he exacted his terrible revenge. With ever-growing confidence, Jane convinced herself and her friends that she no longer needed to be accompanied to work. Sunday the 25th of July was like any other day.
When I got home, roughly 2:45, I take over as grandad, do my babysitting duties, and Jane, because she was working a night shift, just went to grab a few hours extra sleep. What time did she leave? Must have been about 7:30.
At 7:45 p.m, Vass parked his car in a side street, a couple of 100 yards away from the hospital. He knew Jane would arrive for her shift in a matter of minutes. He unloaded his bicycle and rode to the hospital car park. At 8:16, Jane arrived and parked her car. Vass was lying in wait. He spied on her as she locked her car door and walked towards the hospital entrance. When she was halfway, she suddenly turned round and headed back to her car. No one knows why. Vass confronted her, ordering her to drop the rape charges. She refused. Vass pulled a multi-tool from his pocket and attacked her, stabbing her repeatedly with a razor-sharp 7.5 centimetre saw blade attachment. Assuming Jane was dead, Vass turned and walked off.
Jane, I have no idea how is still alive at this point from the evidence that we have. He stabbed her certainly in excess of 50 times, massive stab wounds, heavily bloodstained, really severely injured, and has tried to get back to her car. He has then come back and has then brutally slit her throat. And that's actually the fatal stab wound in the end.
Having made sure she was dead, Vass walked calmly away, got back on his bike and rode back to his car. Jane's injuries were appalling. There were 19 stab wounds to her neck alone, including a wound measuring 13.5 centimetres. It had completely severed her jugular vein. The blood loss was described as catastrophic. There were numerous wounds to her arms where she had tried to defend herself. The cuts were inflicted with intense ferocity from the 7.5 centimetre serrated blade attachment from the multi-tool. Jane's body lay on the ground for just a few minutes before she was rushed into the urgent care unit on the other side of the car park. She was so covered in blood that her colleagues did not recognise her at first. They battled desperately to resuscitate her, but her injuries were too severe.
It was an extremely horrendous attack. Levels of brutality I've not seen in a very long time.
At midnight, Jane's parents were about to go to bed when the police knocked on the door.
Are you Mr. Clough? You have a daughter, Jane? I'm sorry to tell you that we think she's been murdered. And you hope it's not true? They've got it wrong, it's not Jane?
But you know in your heart that if they've come to your home and said they think Jane's been murdered, that, yeah, she's been murdered.
And we're trying to get information, trying to ring the hospital. The hospital is in lockdown.
I knew straight away it was Vass. Nobody else would want to hurt her. I think it's also that kind of feeling that he's got her. He got her.
Jane's colleagues knew immediately that Vass was the killer.
There was only one person it could be, and there was only one person who could have done it. And that was him.
Once Jane had been identified from her name badge, the police knew precisely who they were looking for. Their priority was to find Vass. They recognised now the danger he posed and feared he would embark on a vengeful killing spree. They immediately placed a guard outside the Clough's home.
It's a manhunt then for Jonathan Vass. At the same time, we took great steps to protect his family, his wife, his parents, and also Jane's family.
Vass drove around aimlessly all night long, but as dawn broke, turned his car back towards the Clough's house, where Jane's baby daughter was sleeping, for a final, terrifying act of retribution.
He'd come to kill the baby and torch the house, get rid of us all.
Ambulance technician and steroid abuser Jonathan Vass killed his former girlfriend JaneClough in a frenzied knife attack in a car park of the Blackpool Victoria Hospital on Sunday the 25th of July 2010. But this was not the end of his murderous intent. After killing Jane, Vass set off into the night to kill her family and their child. The police took no chances and placed an armed guard outside the Clough's house. The police were right.
They'd no idea where Vass was. They had suspicions that he might try and come here.
Early next morning, Vass drove to Jane's parents' house, where his baby daughter was sleeping. In the boot of his car were 2 cans of petrol.
He's got unfinished business. His intention is probably to ensure that the car is, you know, a petrol bomb and he's in it too, and the whole lot goes up.
Vass arrived at the Clough's house at 7:30 a.m.
We didn't find him. In effect, he found us.
Round about 7:30, lo and behold, he appears, and we believe that he'd come to kill the baby and torch the house, get rid of us all.
But Vass walked straight into the hands of the waiting police.
He was intercepted by police officers and was arrested.
Vass was furious that female officers were involved in his arrest.
I just think it illustrates his attitude towards women in general, and that he's egotistical and narcissistic and does not like women.
Women to him are just incidental. He wants to have them for his pleasure, but he's not going to let a female tell him what to do.
In custody, Vass showed no remorse, no sorrow, and no regret about killing Jane.
We could quite clearly paint the picture that he had brutally murdered Jane. The only person he was sorry for, in my opinion, was him. his only reaction really was to sit at the floor and feel sorry for himself.
It was never his fault that he'd done all these terrible things. It was always the victim's fault.
The brutal killing shocked the local community.
People were quick to pay tribute to her as a wonderful, friendly, bubbly young woman, and they couldn't believe that she'd been the victim of such a brutal murder.
On the 7th of October 2010, Jonathan Vass appeared at Preston Crown Court, where he pleaded guilty to the murder of JaneClough. A week later, he was back in court for sentencing. It was a painful experience for Jane's parents.
I just wanted to get him for what he's done to Jane.
Jane was given a voice in court when extracts were read out from her diary.
What's he going to do? I don't think we'll get to trial without him doing something to her.
Each passage was another little note in her life leading up to the point when he murdered her, and you know the ending. And to hear that in a cold courtroom with all the family listening in to this horrific abuse of their daughter was very, very difficult.
If he gets found guilty when he's released.
It wasn't until we actually read her diary that we basically read the forecast of her death.
Vass was sentenced to life, with a minimum term of 30 years.
For all the whole time he was in the dock, the only time he showed any sign of being tearful was when he was told he was serving 30 years in prison. He showed no remorse whatsoever.
But in a bitter blow to Jane's family, Vass denied the rapes and assaults, and these charges were placed on file.
It was the thought that Vass was still going to be done for the rapes that carried us through from the murder. So for it not to happen was absolutely devastating.
Vass will be aged 60 before being considered for parole. And if he is released, will not be considered a sex offender.
If he does come out in 30 years, he won't have the conditions that apply to somebody on the sex offenders register.
But Vass didn't totally escape punishment for the rapes.
The judge made it absolutely clear that the motive behind the murder was to prevent Jane giving evidence for the rape charges. That's what raised the tariff for the murder to 30 years. I believe he thought he was going to get out in 15, he would do half and then come out on parole. Actually, that's not the case. He will do 30 before he can even apply for parole. And I'm not convinced he would get it then.
I hate him. I wish him nothing but pain. I hope he's never released. He will still be a dangerous person if he ever comes out.
He is a vile, evil predator.
Jane's murder left her colleagues and friends scarred.
Everybody loved her, enjoyed working with her, and that she isn't here and what happened to her, and it happened to her on hospital grounds, has affected people quite badly, I think.
Jane left behind a baby whose life will forever be tainted by Jonathan Vass.
That baby suffered, you know, for what seemed to be a couple of weeks. She was looking every time the door went, thinking it would be Mummy. She was looking for Jane, and it was heartbreaking to know that she wouldn't see her again.
That man took something so special. Jane was one of those special people that you can only be thankful for, that she was part of your life.